This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Jeffrey Feltman, the John C. Whitehead Visiting Fellow in International Diplomacy at the Brookings Institution. Previously, Mr. Feltman served as the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Political Affairs. Prior to his work at the UN, Feltman was a Foreign Service officer for over 26 years, focusing largely on the Middle East and North Africa, and serving as the Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa while in the State Department. Mr. Feltman joins us today for a discussion on President Trump's recent trip to the Middle East, its outcomes, and the shifting dynamics of the region. Stay with us as we speak with Mr. Jeffrey Feltman. Jeff, thanks so much for joining the call.
Hey, thanks for having me, Michael. I look forward to our conversation.
Well, this was a big week for President Trump, his first big planned international travel. And I wonder, just from a 50,000-foot level, did you see this as broadly reflective of a shift in U.S. foreign policy? The first visit wasn't to traditional geopolitical hubs like Israel, Jordan, and even Egypt, but instead to the financial capitals of the Middle East?
I think it reflected both the reality of where the financial weight is in the Middle East these days, which is the Gulf, and it reflected President Trump's desire for the type of trip he wanted to kick off his foreign travel with, not including the Pope's funeral. It's interesting that he treated all three of these Gulf countries as basically equal friends, as equivalent sources of opportunities. Michael, the last time there was a presidential visit, a sitting president to Doha, Qatar, was when you were back in the George W. Bush White House in 2003. The last time there was a living president that visited Abu Dhabi was also when you were in the White House back in 2008, also George W. Bush. So these were, for Doha and Qatar, for Doha and Abu Dhabi, these were the first presidential visits in quite some time. Of course, Saudi Arabia has hosted the president before. He's hosted the president in May of 2017 during his first term. And of course, Biden went there in 2022, that sort of infamous fist bump trip. But this trip could not be more different than the Biden fist bump trip of 2022. But he basically treated these three countries as equivalent friends, as equivalent sources of opportunities, which is different than the usual presidential trip. And I also believe that he was looking for not for deep policy discussions. I'm sure policy came up. There are many, many issues on which the United States would want to talk to these leaders about. But I think it really was to highlight a new approach to the Gulf, and for the president to show that this transactional deal-making image that he has of himself can produce results.
Yeah, and it sounds like the primary objective, and let me see if you agree with this, was indeed for these nations to make greater investments in the United States. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, the $2 trillion figure that we have is pretty impressive. It gets a bit fuzzy when you try to break it down. But without question, these were significant announcements that the president can rightfully claim credit for. And if you're president of the United States, and you can come back with $2 trillion worth of deals that you can plausibly claim, and you weren't met with protests like you would have had in London or Berlin or Paris, that's a win. This was the happy place for President Trump. He was center stage for basically a little bit more than 3 days in three different countries. You can be forgiven if the stops sort of blurred in your own mind as you watch the media coverage, because there was a lot of similarities. You had the state dinners and palaces with lots of gilt and marble. You had lavish welcoming ceremonies that might include fighter jets or might include people on camels. There's a lot of similarity between the two, but it was basically a feel-good trip for President Trump to be able to show that he's a different kind of leader and that he can produce results. Now, I think that he created, by going to all three countries, kind of what he would see as a healthy competition. A healthy competition, who can design the biggest spectacle, the who can produce the largest number of investments. But that, of course, accrues to his own image of what he wants to do with the Gulf anyway, which is to build deeper relations that benefits the United States.
Gotcha. And it sounds like, since it'd been such a long time that a U.S. president visited Qatar and UAE, were they the unexpected winners from this trip? I expect you might think the new Syrian leader is a winner. Any losers? Winners and losers are.
Go back to your question on Doha and Abu Dhabi, on Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, because this is a real contrast with the first Trump administration. As everyone knows, Trump went to Saudi Arabia, the famous picture of him with the orb and all of that, in May of his first term, May 2017. It was only 2 weeks after that the UAE and Saudi Arabia, along with Bahrain and Egypt, implemented that boycott of Qatar. That boycott of Qatar that vexed U.S. policymakers for almost the entire Trump first term. Complicated how we would do military cooperation. Complicated a lot of things where we would want to work with all of the Gulf countries, but there was this boycott imposed by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That boycott lasted until just 2 weeks before Trump exited office. So this time he's starting out in this term with those three countries, whatever their differences may still be, particularly between Doha and Abu Dhabi, presenting sort of a united front as friends of the United States, presenting a united front that on Iran, for example, yes, we want to see the U.S. and Iran come to a deal. We don't want to see Iran get the bomb, but nor do we want to see Iran get bombed. So I would say that all three of the countries were winners in terms of being able to present a united front to President Trump, in contrast to the divisions that complicated his first administration. But yes, another winner is definitely Ahmed Shara of Syria, and we should talk about that in a bit more detail at some point. But in terms of the losers, I would put Israel and Netanyahu in as the loser. Now the White House would dispute that. The White House would say, Jeff, you're wrong. They're not losers, because the closer Trump can get to the Gulf leaders, the better that is over the long term with Israel. But nevertheless, think about what's happened over the past few weeks. Basically, Israel's concerns have been sidelined. You had the Houthi ceasefire that didn't include Israel. You had that picture of Netanyahu looking very uncomfortable sitting next to Trump in the Oval Office as Trump announces that the U.S. is starting talks with Iran on trying to come up with a deal on the nuclear program. You had the removal of Michael Waltz as National Security Advisor, allegedly because he'd been talking too much to the Israelis about potential war plans. You had the direct meetings with Hamas representatives, which the Israelis reportedly only discovered via intel channels that got the last living American hostage out. And then all the advanced arms sales that we saw to the Gulf, which normally would have some sort of coordination, at least heads up with the Israelis, followed by no Israeli stop on this trip. But I think from the Trump perspective, this makes sense. I don't know that we can conclude over the longer term that this changes the relationship with Israel. Who knows? Time will tell. But the Gulf leaders, they basically obliged President Trump by pomp, by gifts and awards. The Emiratis gave him the highest civilian award they had by the promises and the signatures on trade and investment deals. Where, from Trump's perspective, Netanyahu was always after something. In addition to the $4 billion in military funding, Netanyahu was asking, let's bomb Iran together. Let me flatten Gaza. Let's keep Syria weak and divided. And for a transactional president whose operating principle, to the extent that he has one, is America first, these constant demands from Netanyahu probably become a bit tiresome. And certainly showing up in Israel as Gazans are on the brink of famine and no hostage deal is imminent would have undercut that uplifting image that Trump desired from his Gulf trip. So I think in addition to Israel and Netanyahu, I would put the hostages, their families, and Gazans also as losers on this trip.
Yeah, wow, that's a good contrast between the two. Let's jump into some of these Gulf countries, though. Qatar, of course, plays an intermediary role for the United States, historically, even with the Taliban, of late with Hamas. They are widely criticized in the United States, sometimes for support to Hamas and other terrorists. And of course, there's other controversy arising from that area of the world. Do you think President Trump had a lot of tough asks for Qatar behind closed doors? Kind of see, if you will, just sort of tell us about the state of the bilateral relationship now.
I cannot imagine that the President of the United States and the Emir of Qatar didn't have some pretty deep conversations on Gaza, on the hostage release deal, given the role that Qatar has played over the long years in terms of the relationship with the Palestinians and Hamas in particular, but more recently over the hostage deals. But I don't get the sense that this was, in general, a policy trip. You don't get the sense. I mean, Michael, you know how the NSC works very, very well from your time there, and there weren't sort of hints around town about policy coordination meetings taking place, interagency discussions on exactly how to bring up what issues with what leader in the Gulf. I'm sure that the stuff came up, but yeah. I don't get the sense that it was the same type of policy coordination that you would see in what I'll call, for shorthand, a more traditional administration, be it Republican or be it Democrat. And go back to the Syria example. Before Trump's trip, the U.S. Syria policy was basically paralyzed. There had been a little bit of outreach at the end of the Biden administration. There had been some requests, some demands that were conveyed by the Trump administration to Shar about what we would expect from Ahmed Shar, the interim president of Syria, who of course has an Al-Qaeda ISIS background. But this debate in Washington about, is there an opportunity in Syria? Should we open up? Should we lift the sanctions? Or is once a jihadi, always a jihadi philosophy going to prevail? And it basically locked the system. You had a couple waivers on sanctions, but basically the Syria policy was paralyzed. Now, if you and I were still in government and there's going to be a U-turn in American foreign policy, you know what type of meetings we'd have. You know the type of debate, hand-wringing arguments, discussions, papers that would be done. What happened this time? We have a major U-turn in U.S. foreign policy where the president announces in Riyadh, to great applause, at the Saudi-U.S. investment conference that he has the intentions of lifting all the sanctions on Syria. And then the following day, he meets with Ahmed Shar, as he considered once a jihadi, always a jihadi, by some of his advisors in the White House. Yeah. And that's all due to Trump's gut instincts after his conversations with Turkish President Erdogan and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And so it shows it shows a similarity, frankly, in how the Gulf leaders do their policy, which is top down.
Yeah.
And how Trump operates. So I think that probably the Mohammed bin Salman and the other Gulf leaders recognize the kindred spirit, that he can move things, he can make things move. All we need to do is convince him, and he can do it, as opposed to other administrations that have to study and think about things.
Yeah, would have had months worth of intel reports and the rest. Okay, that's a fascinating contrast as well. Then, let me ask you a little bit before we just give you an opportunity to comment more on the UAE and Saudi. What do you think their message was to the United States on Gaza? Was it, we need to end this war as soon as possible, please lean harder on Netanyahu? What do you think?
I think that's probably the message, but my guess is that it was not delivered particularly forcefully, because the Gulf leaders were looking for a win too. President Trump was looking for a win from this trip, and the Gulf leaders were looking for a win, which is to develop a positive relationship with this administration in its early days, to work with the transactional president who clearly can move the bureaucracy in ways that is, I think, that they would see as unusual in our system. So I'm sure they brought it up. They have to be able to tell their people they brought it up. And in some of the official communiques, it was mentioned about the need to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And the fact that President Trump mentioned the potential starvation of children when he was speaking in Abu Dhabi suggests to me that, yes, it came up in these meetings. But my guess is that it came up in a way that wouldn't be seen as offensive to Trump. They would not bring it up in a way that you're going to be blamed for this if this doesn't work. There would be more brought up about, wouldn't this be better for all of us? You want to end this war. We want to end this war. Please use your leverage to end it. I would imagine that's the sort of tone that it took. I'm sort of just thinking aloud here, Michael, but think about that. I don't know if you saw much of the press coverage of that speech that the president gave at the Riyadh summit, the U.S. Saudi investment summit, on the first night of his trip. And he was connecting emotionally and politically with the leaders who were gathered there. He was addressing something that was of direct concern to those in the room, which is what happens to Syria. He was not being ambiguous about it. He said, I have the intentions of lifting all sanctions. He talked about he praised how, Doha, Abu Dhabi, and Riyadh look as opposed to places where the U.S. had intervened, like Kabul and Baghdad. He talked about the need to move away from sort of human rights discussions and some of the traditional points of friction between what we see as priorities and how the Gulf leaders see their ways of governance. And it resonated, at least with the leaders, and I think it resonated with a lot of the Arabs who were sympathetic to the impoverishment of the Syrian people. Didn't really address the Palestinian issue that's of concern in any great detail. But think about that I'm thinking about that in contrast to Obama's speech in Cairo back in June of 2009. I was in the audience of the Cairo speech, and like Trump, Obama was trying to turn a new page. Obama was trying to he called it a new beginning between the United States and the Muslim world. I don't think Trump used those sorts of words, but Trump clearly was trying to signal a new beginning between the United States and the Gulf states.
Right.
But Obama's speech back in Cairo was very rational. It was at times almost cerebral. He was very reflective, self-reflective on problems the United States had caused or provoked problems among Muslim leaders and how they govern their people. It was a very, very thoughtful speech about what we needed to overcome in order to build better relationships between the United States and the Muslim world. I remember sitting there thinking, this is the speech I have spent my entire Foreign Service career waiting to hear. And there was lots of applause, lots of appreciation for it. But what were the end results? Nothing really tangible came out of it. We sent a few science advisors to build scientific cooperation. The Arabs tended to just forget the part of the speech that criticized them and picked up cherry-picked what they liked, and it didn't really amount to anything. Whereas I think what Trump did was actually convince the Arab leaders that were there, the Gulf leaders, this is different. This is a different type of language from the president, and there's going to be follow-through as we've seen in Syria. Now, I worry as a little bit that they also can manipulate Trump, that they can outcompete with each other for the flattery, for the awards, for the spectacle, and persuade Trump on some things that he might not his advisors might not otherwise think are wise. But in any case, I look at these two speeches from Obama in Cairo and Trump in Riyadh, many years apart, but think both were aiming at trying to set the relationships on a new path. I think Trump is succeeding on that, where Obama did not.
Yeah, maybe one was giving a lecture and one was saying, I'm not going to give you a lecture. That might have been the most memorable part of this. Of course, he called out nation builders and neocons as well, so that was significant also. Just while we're on the Middle East, I mean, do you agree that the boiled down, fundamental, hot molten core issue here is that Hamas is not going to give up its last bit of leverage, which are the hostages, unless they see a pathway to end the war? Is that just fundamentally what we're dealing with here?
Yes, I think that's fundamentally what we're dealing with. And of course, on top of that is that the Israelis, of course, in general, are traumatized by October 7th. Of course, they're traumatized by October 7th. But Netanyahu has an additional interest, which is to stay out of jail. So he would see the end of the war as an existential threat to his political career, because an end to the war means his coalition collapses, meaning he has fewer excuses to avoid judicial accountability, both for some of the corruption charges against him as well as for what happened on October 7th. So it's very, very complicated, where you have Trump wanting to end this war and Netanyahu needing to continue this war for his own, each for their own, Netanyahu for his own political survival.
Yeah. I want to come back around here in a second to the weapons purchases and the other things from the trip, but let's also deal with Iran nuclear. It seems like the president may have been more open to at least Israel bombing the Iranian nuclear program some time ago, but as you outlined at the beginning, he seems like he's moved away from this and saying that we want direct talks with the Iranians, and of course those have begun. And you made reference to this, but let me give you the opportunity to sort of address this explicitly. Do you think there was an identical message from all three capitals that we hope the United States will not engage in bombing Iran or allowing Israel to bomb? I know it was policy light, but do you think that's their true behind closed doors position?
Yes, I believe it is. And of course, this is different than the Emirati and Saudi position was when the Obama administration and the others were negotiating with Iran to produce the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action back in 2015. When the Saudi Arabia and the UAE as well as Israel were opposed to the negotiations. Now these states are for the negotiations. That's different. Israel is not.
So what changed, by the way?
What has changed is their conclusion, the Gulf states' conclusion, that they will be collateral damage, if not direct damage, in any bombing of Iran. Mm-hmm. You may remember in 2019 there were attacks on the Saudi oil facilities in Abqaiq and elsewhere, and the Trump administration did not respond. And then in what was it, January 2022, mm-hmm. there were attacks on the Abu Dhabi airport, and Joe Biden didn't even pick up the phone to call Mohammed bin Zayed to express concern about it. So the Gulf states took a lesson from this, which is that they're not going to be able to count on U.S. protection, in Article 5 NATO-like protection of in case of war where Iran might go after them. So instead, they need to pursue détente with Iran. And you've seen now Saudi Arabia has been in the process for 2 years of the détente with Iran that was announced in Beijing. And just before just a little bit before the Trump visit, it was about a month ago, I guess, in mid-April, Khalid bin Salman, the brother of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the defense minister of Saudi Arabia, went to Iran and met with Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. 4 or 5 years ago, that would have been unimaginable. The defense minister of Saudi Arabia is meeting with the supreme leader of Iran. So they clearly, I don't think that the Gulf states trust Iran. I think that they wish that the geography were different, that these weren't their next door neighbors, but that they realize that for their own protection and for their own diversification of their economy objectives, they cannot afford to be at war with Iran. They cannot afford to have active hostility with Iran. And so I am convinced that for whatever nuances might be different between Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, that their leaders were more or less in harmony, at least, on find a way not to make sure that Iran does not get the bomb, but find a way to make sure that Iran does not get bombed either by you or by the Israelis. But the Israeli message, of course, will be different. And I think, and I still am concerned. I think it's clear that Trump does not like the idea of war in general. We've seen this in Gaza and his attempts to stop the war in Ukraine, his comments on Iran. But this enrichment question is one that is going to be very, very hard to resolve. If our position, if the U.S. position really is that Iran has zero enrichment, which would be consistent with what of course, the Israeli position would be, it's going to be very hard for the Iranians to sort of save face. So I don't know where this goes. I think that we're still in a very risky place when it comes to Iran. There's a lot of talk about the Libya model. And this is, of course, the Libya model. You were also so you were familiar with this because from when you were in the White House. But it's actually I think it's a bad reference because for two reasons. First of all, the Iranians hearing the Libya model will think Gaddafi's dead because he gave up his nuclear program. The end of a regime. But the other thing is, if you remember, the Libya model, the Libya program was still in crates. The U.S. basically used two planes and flew out the entire Libya program, whereas the Iranian nuclear program is far more developed. I mean, I think that basically, if I were in a position of policy influence, which I'm certainly not, I would be saying we need a longer and stronger version of the JCPOA, something that doesn't have the deadlines that the JCPOA had, and something that has stronger inspection regime and stronger penalties if Iran is found to be cheating. But I don't think I would push for zero enrichment for fear that I've then precluded the possibility of getting to a deal I could live with, which is the 3.67% enrichment for civilian nuclear programs under very tight supervision. Anyway, I'm not in a policy position, so I'll shut up.
Well, no, it's just worth noting. I mean, that's what there's substantive reasons on either side, but to be harder core is where Trump is. But if he compromises, it's so much like the JCPOA, which he called the worst deal in history. So he's between a rock and a hard place, it seems to me. But
I think, Michael, I'm interrupting you. I think he can get a better deal because the Iranians are in a much, much weaker position than they were. Of course, that's one of the Israeli arguments for bombing now, while they are in a weak position. But their proxy network is in tatters. Bashar al-Assad is gone. The Israelis have decimated their air defenses and have shown what they could do in case of a hot war. I think the Iranians would be far more amenable to long-term supervision, intrusive inspections than they were for the JCPOA, because Khamenei and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, want to avoid war. And Pezeshkian, the president, who in the Iranian spectrum is leans toward the reformist camps, whatever reformist means in Iran, he wants sanctions lifted. So between the recognition of their own weaknesses and need to avoid war and need to do sanctions, I bet you could drive a hard bargain for basically permanent inspections, which right there would be much better than the JCPOA's deadlines, which if the JCPOA were still in force would now be starting to expire.
So they would keep enrichment, presumably at 3.67%. You would have truly anytime, any place, anywhere IAEA inspections, and that would be it. Would you have some deadlines in there too on advanced centrifuges or not?
You'd have to have an agreement on shipping out the highly enriched uranium already. You would have to get the Iranians to agree to sign on to the additional protocol of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, which allows inspections with no notice. There's a lot of details that people would have to work out. But I think it is possible to get a deal that would allow Iran to have a civilian nuclear program, meaning they would save face, but that would be far stricter, longer than the JCPOA was. But
got it.
But anyway, I think that this is still the big risk in the region. Is will there be an Iran deal or not? That if I were looking at all of these investment deals that were just announced, for the ones that are supposed to take place in the region, that's what I would still be thinking about if I were in a corporation somewhere.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Mr. Jeffrey Feltman.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Well, so back to the trip. One of the reasons that I think you correctly identify for why some of these Gulf states have decided they don't want a bombing of Iran's nuclear program is that they're worried they'll become collateral damage. But at the same time, they're still worried about Iran, and they're making multi-billion-dollar weapons purchases from the United States. I wonder if you might talk about the weapons purchases for just a second and give us some sense, I think, with the UAE and the Saudis, and then you might come around to the Saudis wanting a defense pact with the United States.
Yeah, let me start with that one first, because if you notice, the Saudi language on that has changed. If you remember, during the last year of the Biden administration, when the Biden administration was trying to build on the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia and by trying to entice Saudi Arabia into coming up with an understanding with the Israelis, the Saudis were looking for some kind of Article 5 type security guarantees from the Biden administration. They're no longer talking about that, and I think it's because they realize that it's probably not worth it. That it would not be worth the paper it's written on. That instead they're looking for a different type of security cooperation that would be far more a partnership rather than U.S. security guarantees. And I think that they've had a dose of realism in how they would look at would the U.S. really use all of its military might to protect the Gulf from Iran. It's the Abqaiq example is not a promising one for them, and the talk about NATO countries being freeloaders, as some of the Trump administration see that, I think has sobered the Saudis a bit. Mm-hmm. But these figures that came out of this trip are pretty incredible. $142 billion in sales to Saudi Arabia from a dozen or so defense companies. $42 billion in Qatari purchases, plus the Qataris have promised $10 billion in upgrades to Al Udeid being the major base in Qatar where CENTCOM has over 10,000 troops stationed. The Qatar deal includes drones from Raytheon and remotely piloted aircraft from General Atomics. A lot of announcements were made during this trip that will be of benefit to U.S. Defense contractors. The thing that I'm not a defense guy, but I would hope, given all the concerns that have been expressed about our own supply lines, that this is not going to put further pressure on our own supply lines that have been depleted in some cases because of Ukraine and other issues. But what's been notified for Congress so far, it's far less. Of course, it's only been a week since the trip, so there's a lot of follow-up that has to be done already. So far, it's been $1.6 billion of sales to the UAE that have been notified to Congress, and something like just under $2 billion that have been notified to go to Qatar. Qatar, by the way, was designated a major non-NATO ally by Biden back in 2022. So Qatar's in a special status at this point. That there's an ongoing foreign military sales program of the UAE of like $30 billion. I think that what is probably attractive to those in the administration, in the Pentagon, that do look at our defense commitments and our defense relationships, is that the more that these three countries do buy from us, the better the interoperability will be. The fact that the political tensions between them have not disappeared, but they're certainly less than they were during the first Trump administration, means the type of defense cooperation that we've had with the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, that includes all 6 of the Gulf countries, will have tangible benefits. There's been a number of committees set up between the U.S. and the GCC countries over the years, but many of them are more on paper than they are in practice, and so that these defense sales, these defense relationships, should allow a closer military partnership than I should say that we reach the potential of the type of partnership that many administrations have desired, but that has not happened in practice because of the political differences between them.
Yeah.
But I should say there will be some controversy. You've already seen it. The Democrats, Senator Murphy from Connecticut, Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs from Southern California, they're already saying they're looking for ways to block some of these that have already been notified for Congress. They're citing the UAE's participation in the war in Yemen, as well, and in particular the UAE's support of the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, one of the 2 belligerent forces in Sudan, and the appalling humanitarian situation in Sudan, exacerbated by outside support. Then they're talking about in Qatar, where these Qatar sales are quid pro quo for Trump property deals in Qatar. So the Democrats are going to make noises over these deals, I predict.
Yeah, I think so. Before I shift back to the economic stuff coming out of the trip, especially artificial intelligence, let me ask you just one more question. We talk a lot about normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. What did Saudi Arabia say to Trump on this? Surely Trump pushed this behind closed doors. He wants to be the one to take the Abraham Accords to the next level. Of course, the kingdom is the big enchilada year. What do you think he heard? He heard about the Palestinians. He said, "I want a defense pact." What do you think the conversation went like?
I think that the major issue is the Palestinians and Saudi public opinion. That a Saudi-U.S. nuclear program. There's discussions that was one of the issues that MBS has put on the table with Biden for considering joining the Abraham Accords. That looks like that's going to continue even without the normalization with Israel. The asks on the defense side have evolved with the Trump administration's coming into office. So I think the main hindrance is the Palestinian issue. And I'm not saying that Mohammed bin Salman sits up every night crying about Palestinian children in Gaza. It's a public opinion issue. One of the things I found interesting, I spent most of my career in the Middle East, in the Middle East and North Africa. One of the things that was always sort of hard for us to gauge was, yes, many of these leaders are autocrats, absolute monarchs. But that doesn't mean they aren't affected by their public opinion. That doesn't mean their public opinion can't influence policy. It's not as easy as counting the Knesset members that Netanyahu can rely on in Israel. You know exactly if Netanyahu adopts this policy, you can do the math. He loses this many Knesset members, meaning this happens. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, it's much more opaque, trying to analyze the relationship between government decisions and public opinion. But there is a relationship. And this is one where Mohammed bin Salman simply would not be able to normalize with Israel without having something that he can say he got for the Palestinians. And there's an irony here because, of course, they don't trust Iran at all, but yet they've pursued détente with Iran for the reasons that you and I have already discussed. But he doesn't really believe that he's going to have a positive relationship with Iran. He doesn't really believe he's going to get anything out of Iran except avoidance of war. But with Israel, I think he understands this could be a really interesting relationship with mutual benefits if we can just get past the political issue that he can't move forward without something for the Palestinians to tell his public.
Got it. So many people say, well, he doesn't care so much about the Palestinians. The point is that his population cares about them and he can't ignore them.
That's right.
All right, let's think about how everything played out last week. We are used to presidents going to the Middle East and talking about defense purchases, and we just covered those. But artificial intelligence was a huge topic last week. That is just really new. It, I guess, reflects a sense among these Gulf Arabs that they want to diversify their economies. They've been talking about that for years. It's an activity that all their sovereign wealth funds engage in. Talk a little bit about how artificial intelligence has become one of the new geopolitical bargaining chips.
Well, I mean, this is really interesting too, because this is another complete U-turn from the Biden administration. As you know, these advanced chips are limited in quantity. Everyone wants these advanced chips, and the Biden administration was quite concerned that because the Gulf countries have, they've hedged their bets. They have positive relationships with China, as well as their strong relationships with us. And the Biden administration was very concerned about this technology, chips, ending up in Chinese hands. And so they basically adopted the licensing system to restrict the quantity and quality of the chips that would go to the Gulf. That was how they were going to deal with the Chinese, with the threat of this technology ending up in Chinese hands. The Trump administration has taken an opposite tact, which is, let's build partnerships with these guys. Let's share our most advanced technology with these guys, and that close partnership will be what protects them from leaking it to the Chinese. That they will not want to lose the benefits of that partnership. So it's a completely different approach to the question of unwanted technology transfer to China. And of course, AI needs energy. The production of advanced chips, the whole technology needs energy and needs financing. And the Gulf has cheap energy, and the Gulf has financing. Look at the UAE's National Security Advisor, Sheikh Tahnoun. Sheikh Tahnoun is the head of G42, which is an Emirati AI company. So you've got the National Security Advisor is heading the Emirati AI partner, and he also has control over 1.5 trillion Emirati sovereign wealth fund. So you've got energy, political leadership, money, all in the UAE. So this has led to all sorts of, I can't even keep track of all the AI investments and partnerships that came out of this trip. Some were for investment in the United States. Like another Emirati firm, MGX, is backing OpenAI's Stargate project in the United States. Saudi Arabia said they'll invest $20 billion in U.S. data centers as part of the $600 billion investments that Mohammed bin Salman announced. And then you've got NVIDIA that's selling advanced chips to the UAE, something like 500,000 chips to the UAE and 20,000 to Saudi Arabia. The U.S. and the UAE have announced, I think they called it the AI Acceleration Partnership, that's to build the largest AI data center outside the United States. It's something like 10 miles long. I have a hard time putting my mind around this. And it's just, it's fairly clear that Trump was far more interested in these sorts of deals than in trying to think about, is there a national security risk of offshoring so much of this technological development?
Do we think, I hear so often that one of the reasons or one of the things that we hope to get out of allowing the export of some of these AI-enabled chips to the Gulf was that we were going to ask them to really shut China out of, let's call it, the high technology partnerships that they may have begun to negotiate out with them. You've heard of this dimension, of course. Give me a little sense from your background in the region and your knowledge of this issue in particular. How much of this was driven by concerns about China and the Gulf?
I think a lot of it. But again, I think that the Biden administration took a prove you're a reliable partner, and we'll dole this stuff out to you attitude. Prove it to us that you're not going to give this stuff to China. Whereas the Trump administration said, we're going to embrace this partnership, and as an incentive for you not to share this stuff with China. So I think both administrations have the same concern. They've just taken almost polar opposite views of how to do it. And of course, you can imagine which ones the Gulf leaders like better. The Gulf leaders don't like being told, we don't really trust you until you prove it. They like being told, we're going to embrace this partnership. We welcome your investment in the United States in these technologies, and we will partner with you in your countries in these technologies. You can imagine which one they prefer.
And this just investing in artificial intelligence has really given them a place to go. We've been hearing about 2030 and diversification of oil wealth for a long time, and they are really putting their bet down right here. Isn't that correct?
You're absolutely right. And it's one, too, that probably ticks off Netanyahu, given Israel's strength.
Yeah. He's like, we're startup nation, not you. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
But Israel does not have the same access to energy and capital that these Gulf countries are putting on the table right now.
Yeah. What is your view of the recent efforts by UK, France, and Canada related to sanctions, threats, demands for Israel to end its military actions in Gaza, and UK suspension of trade talks with Israel? Will it have any impact on Israel's actions?
I don't think so. I really think that for Netanyahu, what would make a difference in the conduct of the war is what are his political prospects, what's happening domestically, or is the United States going to really be doing anything punitive? Biden prohibited the sale of 2,000-pound bombs. A few things that held back, but really the United States, whatever concerns it has not questioned Israel in any meaningful, tangible way about its conduct of the war. And I don't think that France, the UK, et cetera, are going to have much impact. It would be if Israeli public opinion, which indicates that they think the primary goal should be the hostage release, not the pursuit of all Hamas leaders. If that would suddenly make a difference in Netanyahu's political calculations, then things might change. Or if Trump would lower the boom in some way. And I don't really see either of those things happening. I think that Netanyahu is going to continue to want to preserve his existing coalition, and to preserve his existing coalition, he has to maintain that war until Hamas, quote, is destroyed.
Yeah. Jeff, the big question, I think, as the year wears on, is if there's no tangible progress in negotiations with Iran on their nuclear program, will Israel go it alone? You've mentioned already that they're weak because their terrorist groups are on their back foot. There's a clearer path for Israeli jets because a lot of the air defenses have been shattered across Syria, even some within Iran. And so it really feels like if Israel was going to do it, it has a window that it might be able to achieve its aims easier than it otherwise would have. Do you think there's a scenario? Let's leave aside for a second whether they need bunker buster bombs. Do you think there's a scenario in which Israel would seek and go forward with a bombing of Iran's nuclear programs without the blessing of the United States?
My guess is that they would go first after some of the economic infrastructure, that they would try to raise the pressure on Iran through bombings that would not risk leaving the nuclear facilities still intact if they didn't know they had the capabilities of destroying them. That you go after the economic infrastructure, hoping of softening Iran up for a better deal.
You don't think they want to go all the way? They would bomb economic targets.
I think they want to go all the way. I don't think they would do it without without U.S. support. And that's what concerns me, though, is that at some point will these negotiations with Iran, reach an inconclusive end that makes it more likely that the U.S. and Israel would agree. And then what happens? I mean, all of us agree. Iran must not get a bomb. I think everyone agrees with that. And I want to give the Israelis credit for what they've done in terms of degrading Iran's proxy network and giving Lebanon and Syria the chance to emerge as something, as in better places than when they were under the tutelage of Assad and Hezbollah. But I guess that I share Trump's instincts. And I don't often say that.
Yeah.
Is that I hope that there's a way to avoid war while making sure Iran has no nuclear weapons capability.
So it's sometimes put this way: they're not going to go without the U.S. blessing because they would be risking the thing most important to the state of Israel, which is the support of the United States. And if you can't rely on the Republicans or at least Donald Trump to back you, you're certainly not going to get, generally speaking, the support of many Democrats under a Republican president. Is that right?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Michael. I would agree with that.
Gotcha.
I'm going to jump back to another part of the conversation really quickly, which is Syria again, because this is another one where we're going to have a serious difference with Israel. Turkey and Israel each see each other as sort of an expansionist state. Netanyahu and Erdogan have a weird obsession with each other, and they're playing out their competition in Syria right now. And Trump has clearly thrown his lot in for now with the transitional president, Ahmed Ashar, the guy who we met, what he said, very, very, proud past all the stuff that Trump said about him. And the Israelis are basically preventing Shah from consolidating his rule in Syria. There are a lot of complications in Syria. We won't go into detail, but one of the complications is Israel bombing sites and occupying parts of Syria beyond the disengagement line of 1974. And so this is going to be another issue the Trump administration is going to have to deal with on Netanyahu. Is a tough policy issue of managing the Turkish-Israeli competition playing out in Syria.
Well, you referenced this earlier, and as we begin to wrap up in the next few minutes here, you said, I think, that Israel's policy for Syria is that it remain broken up, or that there not be one dominant party across. Tell me a little bit more about what their policy is, and is that code for they don't want the Turks taking over Syria?
But, I think that when Netanyahu looks at Erdogan, he sees Muslim Brotherhood. When he sees Muslim Brotherhood, he sees Hamas. He sees October 7th, and he does not want a Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas adjacent, Sunni fundamentalist neighbor. And that's what he sees in Shara. So Netanyahu is definitely in the once a jihadi, always a jihadi camp, and sees Shara and his rule as being an October 7th type, potentially an October 7th type threat to Israel. Shara has said all the right things, including being even of interest in some point joining the Abraham Accords. But who knows who Shara is really? I mean, we can't be naive here. We know what his past is. We don't know what his future is. But I think that it is part of basically the post-October 7th trauma of the Israelis, that you can't have a Sunni extremist neighbor, as they had in Gaza.
Well, what cards were they expecting to play? They don't have many natural allies there, do they? I know they've, the Druze, that's been going on, but what did they expect to do to stymie, Turkish proxies?
Well, I think that they're simply digging in the areas adjacent to the Golan Heights in the Druze areas. We've seen, of course, they took out much of the Syrian military assets after Assad left to make sure they couldn't be used against them. I mean, there is an irony here that for most of the time since '74, there was no fighting between Syria and Israel after '74. The fighting took place in Gaza. It took place in Lebanon. It didn't take place between Syria and Israel. There's sort of an unspoken unspoken rules of engagement with the Assad government. And now Israel's goal seems to be to keep Syria divided so you don't have this Turkey. You don't have Turkey on your borders. But by doing so, by preventing a unified Syria from emerging, by keeping Syria sort of in a bit of a chaotic situation, unfortunately, they opened the door potentially for Iran to come back. Because as we saw in the Lebanon Civil War, in the Yemen Civil War, in the Iraq Civil War, in the Syrian Civil War, Iran is really good at putting down roots in the midst of chaos. And Iran's definitely weakened now, thanks to the Israeli attacks. But that doesn't mean that they don't have the aspiration to try to rebuild some of these networks. And I worry that if you don't allow a strong Syrian state to emerge, and it's hard. It's not just the Israelis that make it hard. It's the mosaic of the population in Syria. Then you have the opportunity for ISIS to reemerge and for Iran to put down roots. But if you're Shara, the interim president, and you're looking at your population, which is multi-confessional, multi-ethnic, and you're looking around the region, and you look at Lebanon, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic, you look at Iraq, multi-confessional, multi-Iraq, you say, I don't really know that I want to have those sorts of governments. Then you look to the Gulf, Sunni states, strong states, and you can sort of see why Shara seems to lean toward a Sunni-type unified state versus the type of pluralistic state that so many of us in the West say, you need to build because that reflects the Syrian population.
Fascinating. Jeff, thank you. This has been a tour de force. We appreciate you joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Michael.
That was Jeff Feltman. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please rate and review the podcast. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.